You know, I had a sermon written. I actually had it done early. Most of it was written by Wednesday morning, which is unusual for me. It was about the Magi and about the gifts they brought to the Christ child. And then things happen. This is that sermon that I had written. In the immortal words of the bumper sticker, and I do always say that I get my best theology from t-shirts and bumper stickers, doo-doo happens, or something like that. What happened was that all hell broke loose in Washington, D.C. Now, as most of you know, I'm a transplanted American, and before I came to Canada, I lived in Washington, D.C. for 20 plus years, and for much of that time, I literally lived in the shadow of the Capitol building. So as you might imagine, some of this hit me kind of hard. An armed group of extremist white supremacist thugs attacked the United States Capitol in an attempt to disrupt the final certification of the results of the November election in which Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were legitimately elected the president and vice president of the United States. Now, I realize that I'm in Canada and preaching mainly to Canadians, but it's also often been said that preachers should preach with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. And as I'm sure most of you, unless you've been living deep in a cave, are aware that there was considerable craziness down in Washington, D.C. this week. And I mean, more than the usual craziness. So that happened Wednesday, and I had my sermon mostly written. So Wednesday night, I called Jeff and I said, what do I do? Do I need to address this? And we mostly decided I didn't need to dwell on it too much. And then I went home and I pondered some more and regrettably watched a bunch more news. And I'm sorry, but I really need to talk about this because honestly, I've had a little trouble concentrating ever since. And in an amazing coincidence, what happened this week in Washington is a very strange parallel with what happened in ancient Bethlehem, as recorded in the Gospel of Matthew. Today, the church celebrates Epiphany, and it's generally celebrated on the Sunday closest to January 6th, which was last Wednesday. So here we are. And Epiphany means revelation or manifestation of God. And it can also mean a spiritual event in which the true essence of something appears to you in a sudden flash of recognition, like in the cartoons when a light bulb appears over somebody's head. That's an epiphany. So what the church celebrates on January 6th is the manifestation of the divine nature of Christ to the whole world, as represented by the Magi, the wise ones who came from afar to seek and worship the Christ child. Now, the Gospel of Matthew doesn't say much about the Magi. There's some current speculation that's been making the rounds on the internet and showed up in my email inbox the other day, which is what would have happened if the three wise men had been wise women. They would have stopped to ask directions, arrived on time, had reservations at the inn, helped deliver the baby, cleaned the stable, made a casserole, and brought practical gifts. But we really don't know much about them from the biblical record. Now, in Persia, around the time of Christ, the Magi were a tribe of priests in the courts of the Persian kings, and they were considered to be people of great holiness and wisdom, skilled in philosophy and medicine and natural science, soothsayers and interpreters of dreams. The fact that they followed a star lends weight to the argument that they were astronomers. And in that time, if they studied the stars for omens, they also almost certainly studied astrology. But we don't know for certain if that's where they were from. Matthew just says rather vaguely that they were from the East. And he suggests that they came from a long, long way. The great distance and the likelihood that they were astrologers and the fact that they didn't know where the Messiah was to be born and hence had to ask Herod's scribes leads most scholars to conclude that they were Gentiles. And so that's why the church celebrates Epiphany as the manifestation of Christ to all nations. We don't know how many of them came. to find the child Jesus. Somewhere along the way, the assumption was made that there were three of them, since Matthew says they brought three gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. But in reality, there may have been only two or a dozen, or, who knows. And the passage that was read from the second chapter of Matthew's Gospel is the traditional lectionary passage for this day in the church year. And it's a long passage, and I kind of abridged it a little for the reading, and the sermon that I had mostly written by Wednesday morning had focused mostly on the Magi and their gifts for the Christ child. But there's more to that passage. That passage from Matthew contains an account of what is known as the slaughter of the innocents, the decree by Herod the Great that all of the boy babies in Bethlehem should be murdered. And I didn't include that in what I sent to the lectors because, well, frankly, it's horrible. And I wasn't going to preach on it. Now I have to read it to you. When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. Just imagine. Herod sent his soldiers, his armed thugs, to slaughter all the boy babies under the age of 2 in Bethlehem because Herod was afraid that this little child, who, as the prophets and the Magi believed, would be king of the Jews. Let me tell you something. Big, tough tyrants, all of them, always, are terribly afraid of anyone with a legitimate claim to the power that they crave for themselves alone. It is not a pretty story, and through history, it never is. And it comes right after Christmas, right after the beautiful story of the babe in the manger, the glorious story of the angelic announcement to the shepherds, right after the wise ones from the east come and adore the Christ child. So understandably, this doesn't get preached on a lot. Honestly, I've only preached on this passage once in my life, and that was when I was still student clergy, just learning how to preach, and basically didn't know any better than to not preach on this passage. Someday I'll tell you about it. It was a bit of a disaster. And it's hard to explain from a pulpit why on earth this is in the Bible. But today, to me, it's kind of timely, because it shows the horrific lengths that some people will resort to in order to hold on to a little bit of power. And power is so often not worth the price that gets paid for it, because power is illusory and transitory. And that's a fact that's often lost on the people seeking it. Where's Herod today? He's dust in the ground. That's where he is. He caused a lot of people a lot of pain and trouble, but in the end, he died. He died a death that the ancient Jewish historian Josephus described as very painful and grotesque. Basically, he was eaten alive by maggots. And if you look at history, you'll find that all the despots that ever lived and breathed eventually die. You know, bless me, I never thought a degree in history, a university degree in history would ever be much use, but you know, in troubled times, it's so useful to be able to look at the past and cry out in the words of the old hymn, "Oh, where are kings and empires now of old that went and came? But Lord, your church is praying yet, 1,000 years the same." They're all gone, and we're still here. Mahatma Gandhi said it best, I think. When I despair, I remember that all through history, the way of truth and love have always won. There have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time they seem invincible, but in the end, they always fall. Think of it, always. And that actually gives me some comfort. Sadly, I suspect it was no comfort to the thousands of people who suffered under Herod's misrule, but in the end, he fell. I'm sorry, this is getting a little depressing, isn't it? Shouldn't I be preaching about some nice uplifting sermon about the beginning of a new year, a new start, new vaccines, new possibilities? And yet, this too is part of the Christmas story, which is both divine and beautiful, as well as human and sometimes ugly. Nadia Bolz-Weber is a wonderful theologian, a Lutheran pastor, and she writes, "But the Epiphany story of Herod and infanticide reveals a God who has entered our world as it actually exists, not as the world we often wish it would be. God's love is too pure to enter into a world that does not exist, even though this is often how we treat Jesus, like we're trying to shelter him from reality. We often behave as though Jesus is only interested in saving and loving a romanticized version of ourselves, an idealized version of our mess of a world. And so we offer to him a version of our best selves with our Sunday school shoes on. We sing songs about kings and drummers at his birth, perhaps so we can escape the Herod in ourselves and in the world around us. God did not enter into the world of our nostalgic, silent night, snow-blanketed, peace on earth, suspended reality of Christmas. God slipped into the vulnerability of skin and entered our violent and disturbing world." She goes on to suggest that if we use our faith as a place to escape the difficult realities of our lives, then we've kind of lost the plot. Spirituality should be the place where those difficult realities are given meaning. We live in a world of difficult realities, you may have noticed. If we had perchance forgotten that for a moment, the past year, and especially for me, the past week, are a hard reminder. We head into 2021 with a mixture of trepidation and anticipation, which I suspect are the same feelings the Magi had when they began their hard journey following a star. We carry the grief of the past year with us, but we tilt our faces toward the light of that star, and with God's help, we will find hope. As we start this new year, one of my prayers for myself and for all of us is that we will find a way to do as the Magi did when they followed the star and when they consulted the scriptures to see where they would find the baby Jesus, and when they laid before him the best things they had. May we do the same with all that we have and all that we are, that we too might find Christ in our midst, an epiphany, if you will, always manifested in our work and in our lives. Amen.